There are no second places in a submarine attack. You either sink the enemy, or you become a tomb for yourself and your crew, sealed in the crushing blackness of the deep. It's a world of cold calculations, of sound and shadow, where a single mistake is the last one you ever make. For the man who would come to command this silent, lethal world, the journey began not by the sea, but in a place about as far from the ocean as one could get. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. His name was Charles Andrews Lockwood, and he was born in the small town of Midland, Virginia, in 1890. But his formative years were spent in the heartland of America, in Lamar, Missouri. This was a world of vast, rolling plains, of railroads and agriculture, a place where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons, not the tides. His father was a surveyor, a man who measured the land with precision and logic. His mother was a teacher, instilling in him a respect for knowledge and discipline. There was nothing in this landlocked upbringing that pointed to a future spent beneath the waves, commanding men in the most claustrophobic and dangerous theater of war. The America of his youth was a nation in transition, a country still feeling its way into a new century of steam, steel, and global ambition. The heroes of the day were pioneers, industrialists, and soldiers who had fought in the recent war with Spain, a conflict that had announced the United States' arrival as a naval power. For a young man with a sharp mind and a restless spirit, the stories filtering back from distant shores, of naval battles and exotic ports, must have seemed like a call to a life far grander than one Missouri could offer. What was it that pulled him toward the sea? Was it a calculated career choice, or the simple, undeniable lure of adventure that has always drawn young men to the horizon? The path he chose was not an easy one. It led to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, a place designed to break down individuals and rebuild them as officers. Here, tradition was absolute, and discipline was the air they breathed. For a boy from the Midwest, it would have been a world of profound culture shock. The intricate etiquette, the demanding academics, the relentless physical training, it was a crucible intended to forge leaders capable of commanding million-dollar warships and the lives of hundreds of men. It was a place where weakness was not tolerated, and where only the most resilient and intelligent could hope to succeed. Surviving Annapolis was one thing, excelling was another. Lockwood did more than survive. He absorbed the lessons of engineering, navigation, and gunnery, but perhaps more importantly, he learned the art of command. He learned how to earn respect in a rigid hierarchy, how to make decisions under immense pressure, and how to inspire confidence in others when facing the unknown. The institution left an indelible mark on him, shaping a quiet, analytical, and intensely focused young officer. The foundations were laid not for a sailor, but for a submariner, a hunter who would need every ounce of that training and resolve in the dark waters that awaited him. Graduation from the Naval Academy is not an end, but a beginning. For most young officers of his generation, the path forward was clear, laid out on the decks of battleships and cruisers, the steel spine of the fleet. A career in the surface navy offered prestige, a clear hierarchy for advancement, and the tangible power of big guns. It was the traditional, respectable choice. But a different current was pulling at a select few, a darker, colder, and far more uncertain current that led down into the crushing pressure of the deep. The submarine service in the early 20th century was not a glamorous posting. It was a fringe community of volunteers, regarded by the mainstream Navy with a mixture of suspicion and morbid curiosity. The The boats themselves were primitive, unreliable, and unforgiving. They were often called pig boats, and for good reason. The air inside was thick with the stench of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and battery acid. They were cramped, claustrophobic, and prone to catastrophic failure. What kind of man, with a promising career ahead of him, would willingly choose to serve in these steel coffins? For Lockwood, it seems the appeal was not in comfort or prestige, but in the challenge. Submarines represented the frontier of naval technology, a new and untested form of warfare that required a different kind of sailor, a different kind of mind. It was a world that rewarded technical mastery and cool-headed problem-solving above all else. Here, a single officer, with a small, hand-picked crew, could wield a power utterly disproportionate to their size. It was a service for thinkers, for engineers, for hunters, and Lockwood was all three. The training was a brutal process of elimination. It was designed to break men who were not suited for the immense psychological strain of living and fighting beneath the waves. The real test was not in the classroom, but in the dive. That moment when the last hatch is sealed, the vents are opened, and the sea begins to swallow the boat whole. It is a moment of absolute commitment, of placing your life entirely in the hands of the machine around you and the men beside you. It is a world where there is no room for error, and every man, from the captain to the cook, must perform his duty flawlessly. To be given command of a submarine was to be handed the lives of dozens of men. It was a responsibility that aged young officers quickly. Lockwood's first commands were on the old S-class boats, vessels known for their mechanical quirks and their tendency to surprise their crews in the worst possible ways. These were not yet the instruments of a global war. They were experimental, temperamental machines, and the men who commanded them were still writing the rulebook, often in response to near disaster. The enemy in those years was not another navy, but physics itself. It was the ever-present threat of a battery explosion, a jammed dive plane, or a hull breach that could send the boat on its final, silent plunge. The interwar period was a long, slow, and often frustrating struggle to turn these fragile platforms into reliable weapons. Every training exercise, every fleet problem, was a battle against the limitations of the technology and the unforgiving nature of the ocean. There are whispers in the records of dives that nearly became permanent, of mechanical failures that were only overcome by the quick thinking of a commander and the discipline of his crew. It was in these moments, far from the eyes of admirals and the polished brass of the surface fleet, that Lockwood began to build his reputation. He was not a man of loud commands or grand gestures. His style was quiet, analytical, and intensely focused on the details. He knew his boat, and he knew his men. This quiet competence began to set him apart. Crews under his command developed a reputation for precision and professionalism. In fleet exercises, his boats seemed to appear where they were least expected, delivering their simulated attacks with an unnerving efficiency. He was not just driving the boat, he was thinking like a predator, using the ocean itself as his camouflage, turning the inherent weaknesses of his vessel into tactical strengths. He understood that submarine warfare was not about brute force, but about patience, stealth, and a perfect, fleeting moment of opportunity. But what truly began to distinguish Lockwood was his obsession with the machine itself. He was not content to simply operate the equipment he was given. He constantly questioned its design, its performance, its limitations. He saw things that others missed, or perhaps chose to ignore. A torpedo that ran deeper than it was set for. Another that seemed to veer off course for no logical reason. These were not isolated incidents, but patterns, subtle flaws in the Navy's most secret and expensive weapon. His reports were different from those of his peers. They were less about procedure and more about performance, filled with detailed technical analysis and pointed questions for the naval bureaus back in Washington. This did not always make him popular. The Navy, like any large institution, was resistant to change and protective of its established programs. To question the reliability of the standard-issue Mark 14 torpedo was to question the very foundation of American submarine doctrine. It was a dangerous career move, yet he persisted. He knew that in a real war, these small, nagging technical problems would become fatal liabilities. A torpedo that runs too deep is a torpedo that misses. A torpedo with a faulty detonator is just a very expensive piece of metal that bounces harmlessly off an enemy hull. He was fighting a battle on two fronts, one against the sea and the limits of his boats, and another against the institutional inertia of the very organization he served. This quiet, internal struggle defined his career through the 1930s. While the world drifted closer to conflict, Lockwood was focused on perfecting the weapon he knew he would soon have to use. He served in staff positions, taught at the submarine school, and commanded submarine divisions, all the while gathering data, building his case, and earning the respect of a generation of younger officers who saw in him a leader who understood their world. He was becoming a submariner's submariner. The games were ending. The fleet exercises, once a matter of professional pride, were now rehearsals for a war that felt less like a possibility and more like an inevitability. The quiet hum of machinery in the belly of a submarine began to sound less like a machine at work and more like a clock ticking down. As Europe began to burn, Lockwood found himself in a key position, serving as a naval attaché in London, where he could observe the brutal realities of the Battle of the Atlantic firsthand. He saw what worked, what failed, and what the human cost of undersea warfare truly was. Then came the news from the Pacific, a flash of violence at a place called Pearl Harbor. The American battle fleet, the pride of the surface navy, was left twisted and burning. And suddenly, the theoretical problems, the faulty torpedoes, the untested crews, and the quiet warnings of men like Charles Lockwood were no longer theoretical. The silent service was being called to war, and he was about to be thrust into its very heart, tasked with fighting an enemy across the vastness of the world's largest ocean. The great steel titans of the battle line were gone, resting in the shallow, oil-slicked waters of the harbor. The aircraft carriers, by sheer luck, had been at sea, but they were few, and they were vulnerable. The entire weight of the war in the Pacific, the only real hope of striking back at an empire that now seemed invincible, suddenly fell upon the shoulders of a few hundred men sealed inside thin steel tubes, scattered across an impossibly vast ocean. For them, the war had begun, and their primary weapon was a mystery. The first patrols went out with a mix of grim determination and nervous energy. They were the tip of the spear, the only American forces capable of taking the fight to the enemy's home waters. The reports that trickled back were confusing, filled with a sense of profound frustration. Skippers told stories of perfect approaches, of textbook attacks delivered from ideal positions. They spoke of firing spreads of torpedoes at lumbering tankers and valuable warships, only to watch them sail away, often seemingly unaware they had even been targeted. The sound became a recurring nightmare, passed in hushed, angry tones from one returning crew to another. A solid, metallic clang, heard clearly through the hydrophones, the unmistakable sound of their torpedo hitting the enemy's hull. It was the sound that should have been followed by a cataclysmic roar, by the groaning of tortured steel. Instead, there was only a baffling, infuriating silence. The Bureau of Ordnance, the powerful naval department responsible for the weapon's design and manufacture, was adamant. The Mark 14 torpedo was the finest in the world. The problem, they insisted, must be with the men firing it. In the midst of this crisis of faith and function, Lockwood was given command. First in Australia, then at the nerve center of the Pacific submarine war, Pearl Harbor itself. He inherited a force armed with immense courage, but crippled by a fundamental, unspoken doubt in its own primary weapon. The official line from Washington was clear, but the stories from his skippers, the men on the front line, told a different, more troubling tale. He was now caught between the careers of his subordinates and the authority of his superiors. He did something that, in the rigid world of the military, can be a radical act. He listened. He trusted the men who were risking their lives in the deep. While engineers and bureaucrats thousands of miles away insisted their calculations were perfect, Lockwood saw the truth in the exhausted, angry faces of his returning commanders. He decided to turn the vast ocean into his own laboratory, to test the weapon not in a controlled facility, but in the real world, under conditions that mimicked combat. His first target was the torpedo's running depth. The official manuals said one thing, but the skippers suspected another. Near Albany, in Western Australia, he ordered a series of tests that were as simple as they were brilliant. He had his men fire torpedoes with dummy warheads at a large fishnet, set at a specific, known depth. The results were immediate and undeniable. Torpedo after torpedo, set to run at 10 feet, ripped through the net more than 10 feet deeper. The problem was not the aim of the skippers, it was the engineering of the weapon. They had been firing their torpedoes harmlessly underneath the enemy's ships. With one problem identified, another, more complex one remained. Even when the depth was corrected, the torpedoes still failed to detonate. Lockwood turned his attention to the secret and highly sensitive magnetic exploder, a device designed to trigger the warhead by sensing the magnetic field of a ship's hull, allowing it to detonate under the keel for maximum damage. It was a sophisticated piece of technology, perhaps too sophisticated for the rigors of war. In a move that bordered on insubordination, he authorized his commanders to deactivate the magnetic feature and rely on the simpler, direct contact exploder. The effect was dramatic. Suddenly, ships that had been shrugging off hits began to break apart. Sinking tonnage reports started to climb. But the fight was not over. Even with the depth corrected and the magnetic exploder disabled, an unacceptable number of torpedoes were still hitting their targets and failing to go off. They were duds. The final ghost in the machine was the contact pistol itself, the firing pin mechanism that was supposed to detonate the warhead on impact. The final decisive test was almost brutally simple. At Pearl Harbor, a crane lifted a live torpedo warhead and dropped it from a height of about 90 feet onto a solid steel plate, simulating a perfect 90-degree hit. It failed to explode. They tried again and again. The firing pin mechanism, it turned out, was too delicate. It worked fine in angled, glancing blows, but in a direct, solid strike, the kind of shot every skipper dreamed of, the shock of impact could deform the guide channels, stopping the firing pin before it ever reached the detonator. The weapon was not just flawed in some cases, it was inert. It had taken nearly 2 years of war, countless missed opportunities, and the relentless, data-driven persistence of Charles Lockwood to uncover the truth. It was a victory won not with explosions and depth charges, but with calipers, calculations, and an unshakable belief in his men. And now, with a weapon that finally worked, he could truly unleash them. The weapon finally worked, but solving one problem only revealed a much larger one. A reliable torpedo was just a tool. The real question, the one that haunted the command center at Pearl Harbor, was how to use that tool to break an empire. Sinking a lone freighter was a tactical success, but it wouldn't end the war. The enemy was a sprawling maritime nation, a web of islands and conquered territories connected by thousands of miles of sea lanes. These were the arteries of the Japanese war machine, pumping oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, and rice from Southeast Asia back to the homeland. And Charles Lockwood knew his submarines were the only scalpel that could reach in and sever them. For the first 2 years of the conflict, the American submarine campaign had been a series of disconnected efforts. Individual skippers, men of incredible bravery, would go out on patrol, hunt for what they could find, and return. Some were spectacularly successful, others vanished without a trace. There was courage, there was sacrifice, but there was no overarching design, no single unifying strategy to bring Japan to its knees. The war in the Pacific was a vast, sprawling thing, and the submarine force, for all its potential, was still punching sporadically instead of landing a knockout blow. The clock was ticking, and the island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific was proving to be a brutal, bloody affair. Lockwood now faced a crisis not of mechanics, but of imagination. He had to transform his command from a collection of lone hunters into a systematic, relentless instrument of economic destruction. The pressure from his own superior, Admiral Chester Nimitz, was immense. Nimitz was fighting a surface war, planning massive invasions that would cost tens of thousands of lives. He needed the submarine force to do more than just sink warships. He needed them to starve the enemy, to drain the fuel from their tanks, to stop the flow of raw materials to their factories. He needed Lockwood to make the entire Japanese empire wither on the vine. This was a race. While Lockwood had been fixing his torpedoes, the Japanese had been improving their defenses. They were learning, slowly and painfully, how to hunt submarines. They were organizing their shipping into convoys, equipping escorts with better sonar and more depth charges. The hunting grounds that had once been relatively safe were becoming increasingly lethal. Every patrol was a gamble, and the odds were shifting. Lockwood's window of opportunity, that moment when his technical and tactical advantage was at its peak, was closing. He had to strike hard and decisively before the enemy learned how to strike back. His answer was a strategy of total blockade. He envisioned a campaign that would be methodical, patient, and utterly ruthless. His submarines would no longer just patrol randomly. They would be positioned with a strategist's precision, sitting astride the most critical shipping lanes, waiting. They would focus on the tankers, the ore carriers, the troop transports. They would attack not just the ships, but the very idea of safe passage. His goal was to make the cost of moving anything by sea so high that the Japanese economy would simply seize up and collapse. It was a cold, calculated vision of modern warfare. This was not a universally popular idea. Some in the Naval High Command still saw submarines in their traditional role, as scouts for the main battle fleet or as defensive weapons to protect friendly shores. To send the entire force out on a dedicated campaign of commerce raiding seemed, to some, like a misuse of a valuable asset. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. If it failed, he would have squandered his force for little gain. But Lockwood was convinced it was the only way to shorten the war and save lives in the long run. He was betting everything: his career, the lives of his men, and a significant part of the American war effort on this one, audacious idea. He began to orchestrate the war from his headquarters with the meticulous care of a conductor. He divided the vast Pacific into operational areas, assigning specific submarine packs to choke points like the Luzon Strait or the waters off Formosa. He studied shipping patterns, seasonal weather, and the enemy's naval dispositions. He was no longer just a commander, he was the master of a complex, three-dimensional chess game played out across millions of square miles of ocean, where the pieces were submarines and the prize was the industrial lifeblood of Japan. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, a burden carried in the quiet hours of the night, staring at the immense map that covered his wall. Every decision carried the potential for triumph or disaster. Sending a wolf pack to a specific location could result in a spectacular series of sinkings, or it could lead them straight into a well-laid anti-submarine trap. He had to trust his intelligence, trust his commanders, and trust his own strategic instincts. The era of improvisation was over. The Silent Service was about to launch a coordinated, systematic campaign of annihilation. A war fought in the shadows, far from the headlines and the famous fleet battles. A war that, if successful, might never be fully understood by the public, but would be felt in every factory and every port in Japan. The key to this new, aggressive strategy was information. Deep within the basement of his Pearl Harbor headquarters was a unit known as Station Hypo, the Combat Intelligence Unit. Here, a brilliant team of cryptanalysts worked around the clock, breaking the Japanese naval and merchant marine codes. They could read the enemy's mail. This intelligence was Lockwood's secret weapon, a decisive advantage that turned the vast, empty ocean into a transparent battlefield. He knew where the convoys were forming, what routes they would take, and what kind of escort they had. He could now guide his submarines to a precise point in the ocean to intercept a specific target. The hunt was no longer a matter of luck. It was a matter of execution. In the operations room, known as the submarine plot, the war unfolded in near silence. Men moved markers across massive charts of the Pacific, tracking the known positions of American submarines and the predicted paths of Japanese convoys. Radio messages, encrypted and brief, would come in from the boats on patrol, reporting a sinking or a new contact. The intelligence from the code breakers would flow in, and new orders would flow out. Lockwood presided over this nerve center, a calm, authoritative presence in the midst of a silent, deadly storm. He was waging a war of information, directing his unseen assassins with deadly precision. He organized his submarines into coordinated attack groups, an American version of the German wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic. 3 or 4 submarines would work together, commanded by the most experienced skipper. They could surround a convoy, launching attacks from multiple directions at once, overwhelming the escorts and creating chaos. The lead commander of the pack had the authority to direct the other boats, a level of tactical freedom that was essential in the fluid, fast-moving environment of a convoy battle. It was a lethal combination of centralized intelligence and decentralized command. This new doctrine turned the submarine force into the most effective weapon in the entire American arsenal, tonnage for tonnage. The year 1944 became the year of the submarine. While the world watched the great carrier battles and the amphibious landings, Lockwood's men were quietly gutting the Japanese empire from within. In the waters of the Philippines, the South China Sea, and the straits leading to Japan, they waged a relentless campaign. Tanker after tanker, loaded with the fuel needed for Japanese carriers and planes, was sent to the bottom. Troop ships carrying reinforcements to beleaguered island garrisons simply disappeared. The numbers were staggering. In that single year, American submarines sank over 600 Japanese merchant ships, accounting for millions of tons of shipping. They also sank a significant number of warships, including battleships and aircraft carriers that blundered into their patrol areas. They were strangling the enemy. The flow of oil from the south dwindled to a trickle and then stopped almost completely. The Japanese Navy, for a time the most powerful in the world, found its largest warships confined to port, not by enemy blockade, but because they simply had no fuel to sail. This was the quiet, invisible climax of Lockwood's career. It was not a single, dramatic battle, but a slow, inexorable squeeze that lasted for months. His victory was measured in shipping manifests that never arrived, in factories that fell silent for lack of steel, in aircraft that remained on the ground for lack of gasoline. He had crippled an entire nation's ability to wage war, and he had done it from a command post thousands of miles away, using little more than a map, a radio, and the courage of the men he sent into the deep. It was a new kind of warfare, impersonal and brutally efficient. A victory won on charts and with radio intercepts. The success was undeniable, a strategic masterpiece that directly contributed to the shortening of the war and the ultimate Allied victory. Yet there was something profoundly unsettling about it. The same logic, the same cold calculation that could so effectively dismantle an enemy's economy also raised difficult questions about the lines that are drawn in total war and the human cost of such an absolute strategy. The war under the waves had its own code and its own unforgiving price. That price was paid first and foremost by his own men. The United States submarine force in the Second World War had one of the highest casualty rates of any branch of the American military. Nearly 1 in 5 submariners who went to war never returned. They were a special breed, volunteers all, who chose to fight in the most claustrophobic and unforgiving environment imaginable. Lockwood knew these men. He interviewed the commanders. He understood their families. He felt the loss of every single boat. When a submarine was lost, it was almost always a total loss. There were no lifeboats, no parachutes, no distress calls that could be answered in time. A boat on patrol would simply cease to report. On the massive plotting board at Pearl Harbor, its marker would be moved to a list of the overdue, and then, after a period of grim, silent hope, to the list of those presumed lost. It was a clean, administrative act that masked a brutal reality. 71 American submarines were lost during the war, and with them went thousands of men, entombed forever in the deep. The loss of a commander he had personally selected and mentored was a particularly heavy blow. Men like Howard Gilmore, who earned the Medal of Honor by ordering his own boat to submerge while he lay wounded on the bridge, saving his crew at the cost of his own life. Or Dudley Morton, the brilliant and aggressive skipper of the USS Wahoo, who, along with his entire crew, vanished in the Sea of Japan. These were not just names on a list, they were the point of the spear, and their loss was felt throughout the entire force. There was also the moral price of the strategy he was now perfecting. The campaign against Japan was one of unrestricted submarine warfare. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the orders from the highest levels were unequivocal: sink every vessel, naval or merchant, flying the enemy flag. This was a brutal, total war logic, and it meant that Lockwood submarines were not just sinking warships, but also the freighters, tankers, and transports that were the lifeblood of the Japanese Empire. One has to wonder what the weight of a single command felt like, issued from the relative safety of a bunker in Hawaii, that would send a crew of 80 men thousands of miles away to unleash an almost unimaginable destructive force. He was insulated from the fire and the chaos, but he was the architect of it all. The burden of command is a lonely one, and for Lockwood, it was amplified by the sheer distance and the unseen nature of the conflict he directed. He saw the results as reports and statistics, but he knew each number represented a violent, final event in the dark water. The human cost on the other side was immense. His submarines sent hundreds of thousands of Japanese sailors, soldiers, and merchant mariners to the bottom of the Pacific. It was a cold, calculated campaign of attrition, and its success was built upon a staggering loss of life. The very efficiency of the system he had created using code breaking to find a convoy and wolf packs to destroy it made the process chillingly impersonal. A contact on a sonar screen became a target, a solution was plotted, and torpedoes were fired. The humanity of the men on the other end of that attack was a distant, almost abstract concept. This success also created its own dangers. As the American submarines became more and more lethal, the Japanese were forced to improve their anti-submarine tactics. They deployed more escort ships, better depth charges, and aircraft for patrols. The seas became more dangerous, not less. Every successful attack increased the enemy's desperation and resolve to hunt down the attackers. The war under the waves was a constant, escalating duel of technology and nerve, and the price of a single mistake was absolute. By the early months of 1945, the campaign had reached its inevitable conclusion. Lockwood's submarines had, quite literally, run out of targets. They had so thoroughly devastated the Japanese merchant marine that the Empire's shipping lanes were all but empty. The once teeming sea routes between Japan and its conquered territories in the south were now vast, silent expanses of ocean. The silence in the shipping lanes was the ultimate testament to their success. A victory so complete, it had erased its own reason for being. The mission of the submarine force began to change. With no more convoys to hunt, they were tasked with new roles. They acted as lifeguards, patrolling near the Japanese coast to rescue downed American airmen from the B-29 bomber raids. They conducted reconnaissance, slipping into enemy harbors to photograph defenses. They even landed spies and commandos on hostile shores. They had become the versatile, clandestine tool of a war that was entering its final, violent chapter. The world remembers the end of the war in the Pacific for the mushroom clouds that rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a sudden, terrifying conclusion that seemed to eclipse everything that had come before it. But for the men of the silent service, the end had been coming for months, in the slow, steady strangulation they had imposed upon the enemy. The atomic bombs were the final blow, but the Japanese war machine had already been hollowed out from within, starved of fuel, steel, and food by Lockwood's unseen fleet. On the 2nd of September, 1945, Charles Lockwood stood on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. He was there to witness the formal surrender of the Japanese Empire. It was a moment of immense public finality. Around him were the great admirals and generals of the war, the faces of the public victory. Yet his own war had been fought in secret, in the quiet of an operations room and the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. He had commanded the largest submarine force in history and presided over one of the most decisive naval campaigns ever waged, yet his name was largely unknown to the public he had served. After the war, he continued his service, eventually becoming the Inspector General of the Navy. He wrote his memoirs, giving a voice to the silent service and cementing the story of its struggles and its ultimate triumph. He had inherited a force on the brink of a crisis of confidence, armed with a faulty weapon, and transformed it into an instrument that had fundamentally altered the course of the war. He was not a warrior who stared his enemy in the eye. He was a systems builder, a problem solver, a master of a new, more distant kind of conflict. His legacy is as deep and as quiet as the ocean in which his men fought. He was the man who demanded proof when others demanded faith. He trusted his skippers when the bureaucracy dismissed them. He took a broken weapon and made it work, took a scattered force and made it a wolf pack, and took an intelligence advantage and turned it into a weapon of strategic annihilation. He was the admiral of the depths, and his victory was written in the silence of an ocean swept clean. To the men he sent into the crushing darkness of the deep, he was not Vice Admiral Lockwood. He was simply Uncle Charlie. It is a strange term of endearment for a man who held the power of life and death over thousands. It suggests a warmth, a familiarity that seems completely at odds with the cold, mathematical business of sinking ships. But the name stuck for a reason. It spoke to a different kind of command, one built not on fear or distance, but on a foundation of shared experience and profound respect. He had been one of them. He understood the smell of diesel fuel and stale air, the constant oppressive humidity, the unique terror of hearing an enemy destroyer pass overhead. This wasn't an admiral who ruled from a remote headquarters, issuing orders based on charts and reports alone. Lockwood made it his business to be on the docks at Pearl Harbor when a submarine returned from patrol, no matter the hour. He would be there to greet the skipper and the crew, to hear their stories firsthand, to understand their frustrations and their triumphs. He listened. When the skippers complained about the torpedoes, he did not dismiss them as exaggerating or incompetent, a stark contrast to the attitude that had prevailed before his arrival. He trusted the men on the front line, and in doing so he earned a fierce loyalty that no amount of regulation could ever command. His concern went beyond the weapons and tactics. He fought for his men's well-being with the same tenacity he applied to fighting the enemy. He knew that a tired, poorly fed crew was an ineffective crew. He pushed for the installation of air conditioning in the submarines, a move that dramatically improved habitability in the sweltering Pacific. He established rest and recuperation camps where crews could decompress after months spent in a steel tube beneath the waves. Better food, better living conditions, access to relaxation, these were not indulgences. In Lockwood's mind, they were critical components of the war machine, as vital as a working torpedo or a clean periscope lens. Yet beneath the avuncular, caring exterior, there had to be a core of absolute steel. Lockwood was the man who looked at the casualty figures. The United States submarine force had the highest loss rate of any branch of the American armed forces in the war. 1 in 5 submariners who went out on patrol did not come back. He knew every boat, every skipper, every loss. He carried the weight of those losses personally. Did he ever show it? Accounts suggest a man who remained outwardly calm, focused, and professional. But the burden of sending men you know, men you respect, to such a high-risk environment must have been immense. The friendly uncle was also the unflinching commander who had to accept those losses as the necessary price of victory. He was a new kind of admiral for a new kind of war. He was not a swashbuckling fleet commander like Halsey, nor a grand strategist in the mold of Nimitz. He was a systems analyst, an engineer of destruction who understood that victory was a matter of solving a series of complex, interlocking problems. He was methodical, persistent, and more interested in results than in glory. His personality was perfectly suited to the silent service itself, unseen, unglamorous, but devastatingly effective. He did not seek the spotlight, he sought to give his men the tools they needed to win, and then get out of their way. There is a deep and unsettling paradox at the heart of the American submarine campaign. The United States had entered the First World War in part because of its outrage over Germany's use of unrestricted submarine warfare. It was seen as a barbaric practice, a violation of the established rules of conflict. Yet, within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the order was given for American submarines to wage that very same kind of war against Japan. How was this decision made? Was there any debate, any hesitation about crossing that moral line? The historical record is surprisingly quiet on this point, as if the shock of the initial attack swept away all previous objections. The decision was made, and the silent service was unleashed to sink, without warning, any Japanese vessel it could find, military or merchant. What if the torpedoes had never been fixed? It is a chilling question to consider. Without Lockwood's relentless pressure and Christie's ingenious tests, the American submarine fleet might have remained a frustrated and only marginally effective force for another year, or even longer. What would that have meant for the wider war? Japan's war machine was entirely dependent on sea transport for oil, rubber, and food. A less effective submarine campaign would have meant a stronger, better supplied Japanese military. The island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific would have been even bloodier. And perhaps most significantly, it might have made the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, an unavoidable necessity, at a projected cost of 1 million American casualties. The fate of the entire war may well have turned on a few faulty components inside a metal tube. Then there is the question of the codebreakers. It is now known that American intelligence had broken the Japanese naval codes, giving Lockwood and other commanders an almost unbelievable advantage. They often knew where Japanese convoys would be and what their escort strength was. But this knowledge was the most closely guarded secret of the war. Did Lockwood ever have to make a terrible choice to protect that secret? Was he ever forced to let a target go? Or even knowingly send a submarine into a less than ideal situation to avoid letting the Japanese suspect their codes were compromised? It is the ultimate commander's dilemma, sacrificing a piece on the chessboard to ensure you can still see the whole board. The full extent of these calculated risks may never be known. Rumors have persisted for decades about the true nature of some of the submarine force's targets. The official policy was clear, but war in the deep ocean is a murky business. There were persistent whispers among the crews about hospital ships, marked with the Red Cross, that were suspected of secretly transporting troops and high-value military cargo. In the split-second world of a periscope attack, how could a skipper be certain? A vessel zigzagging at high speed, behaving like a military transport, raised suspicion. Did some commanders take the risk and fire, believing they were preventing enemy reinforcements from reaching a battlefield? These are the morally gray areas of conflict that are rarely captured in official histories, existing only in the whispered stories of the men who were there. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all is why Charles Lockwood himself is not a more celebrated figure. He commanded the largest and most successful submarine force in history. His campaign was arguably the single most decisive factor in the economic collapse of the Japanese Empire, setting the stage for the final victory. Yet his name is not spoken in the same breath as the great generals and fleet admirals of the war. Was it because his victory was one of attrition, a slow, invisible strangulation rather than a dramatic, fiery battle? Or was it a reflection of the man himself, a quiet professional who defined himself by the success of his subordinates, rather than his own public profile? He was the admiral of the shadows, and it seems that, in the end, history has left him there. The sheer scale of the campaign's success is difficult to grasp. It was not a series of naval battles, but a slow, methodical annihilation. By the end of the war, more than 60% of Japan's merchant fleet lay on the ocean floor. Over 1,000 ships gone. This was not just a military loss. It was the severing of an empire's arteries. The effect on Japan's war industry was catastrophic and absolute. Factories fell silent not from bombing, but from starvation, deprived of the iron ore, the bauxite, the rubber that had to cross the water. The Imperial Japanese Navy, in its final desperate sorties, sometimes sailed with barely enough fuel to reach the battle, with no hope of returning. This economic strangulation reached deep into Japanese society, far from any battlefield. The submarine blockade meant that food could no longer be reliably imported. The government's official rations dwindled to near starvation levels. Civilians were encouraged to find edible weeds and forage for acorns. The campaign that Lockwood directed from his headquarters in Hawaii was felt in the gnawing hunger of a child in Tokyo, in the quiet desperation of a family struggling to survive a winter with no fuel for heat. It was a form of siege warfare waged on a scale never before seen, targeting not just an army, but the entire industrial and social fabric of a nation. This very success raises one of the most profound and unsettling questions of the entire war. By the summer of 1945, the submarine campaign had effectively won the economic war. Japan was isolated, its industries were crippled, and its population was starving. The nation was, by any rational measure, defeated. Yet the fighting continued, fueled by a military code that forbade surrender. Did the overwhelming effectiveness of the blockade, in a strange and terrible paradox, help set the stage for the atomic bomb? By proving that Japan could be brought to its knees, yet still refuse to yield, did it create the argument that only a weapon of unprecedented power could shock the leadership into accepting the inevitable, and thus avoid a land invasion that would have cost millions of lives on both sides? The legacy of Lockwood's command extends far beyond the events of 1945. It is imprinted on the very DNA of the modern United States submarine force. He cultivated a unique culture of command, one of calculated aggression, technical mastery, and profound trust in the judgment of his skippers. He understood that a man thousands of miles from home, 100 feet beneath the waves, had to have the autonomy to make his own decisions. This philosophy of empowering the commander on the scene, of prizing initiative over rigid adherence to a plan, became the bedrock of the silent service. It is a direct line from the diesel boats of the Pacific War to the nuclear-powered submarines that patrol the world's oceans today. And what of the rules of war themselves? The campaign waged by Lockwood's submarines, along with the German U-boat campaigns in the Atlantic, effectively rendered the old laws of the sea obsolete. The established cruiser rules, which required a warship to surface and give warning to a merchant vessel before sinking it, were swept away in the tide of total war. A new, harsher reality was established, one in which any ship sailing under an enemy flag was considered a legitimate target. This precedent, born of necessity in the world's greatest conflict, redefined naval warfare for the modern age, creating a new set of unwritten rules that persist to this day. Deep beneath the shipping lanes of the Pacific, a silent testament to this forgotten war remains. Thousands of ghostly wrecks, the ships that Lockwood's men sent to the bottom, are scattered across the seabed. They are war graves, but they are also time capsules, many still holding their final cargo. Tankers full of oil, freighters carrying raw materials, their steel hulls slowly surrendering to the pressure and the salt. This submerged fleet is the campaign's most enduring physical legacy, a vast, unseen memorial. It is also a reminder that the consequences of war do not simply end when the fighting stops, but linger on, hidden in the dark, for generations to come. A commander is only as good as the trust he commands. For Charles Lockwood, that trust flowed from the very top. His direct superior, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the entire Pacific Theater, was himself a former submariner. This shared past created a bond that went deeper than rank. It was a silent understanding between two men who knew the unique pressures of the deep, the claustrophobia, the calculated risks, the loneliness of command beneath the waves. This common ground gave Lockwood a degree of autonomy that was the envy of other commanders. Nimitz seemed to grasp instinctively what his submarine chief needed, providing the resources and, more importantly, the freedom to wage his war as he saw fit, without the constant second-guessing that plagued other branches of the service. This trust was mirrored in the relationship Lockwood cultivated with his own men. To the weary crews returning to Pearl Harbor or Fremantle, he wasn't just the admiral, he was Uncle Charlie. He made it a point to be on the pier to meet every returning boat, a bottle of whiskey in hand for the skipper and a genuine handshake for the crew. He listened to their stories, their complaints about faulty torpedoes, their suggestions for new tactics. This was not mere showmanship. It was a profound act of leadership, a signal that their voices were heard, that their immense sacrifices in the dark were seen and valued by the man at the very top. He was building more than a fighting force, he was forging a family, bound together by a shared, perilous duty. Yet this self-contained world of the submarine force had to exist within a much larger, often contentious, military machine. The relationship with the Army Air Forces, in particular, could have been one of rivalry, two services competing for resources and glory. Instead, it became one of the war's most remarkable partnerships. Lockwood's submarines began performing lifeguard duty, stationing themselves near targets in Japan to rescue downed American airmen. This mission, which carried its own extreme risks, had an incalculable effect on the morale of the bomber crews. Knowing that a submarine was waiting for them, that a hand might reach out from the sea to pull them from the wreckage, gave them the courage to fly those final dangerous miles over the target. Perhaps the most famous of these rescues underscores the profound impact of this cooperation. In September of 1944, a young Navy pilot was shot down during a raid on Chichijima. He was the sole survivor of his crew. Adrift and alone in enemy waters, his prospects were grim. But then, a periscope broke the surface. The submarine was the USS Finback. The pilot they pulled from the sea that day was a future president of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush. Hundreds of other airmen owed their lives to these silent lifeguards, a bond of mutual respect forged in the crucible of combat, a testament to a form of inter-service cooperation that transcended traditional rivalries. The Pacific was not an exclusively American theater, and Lockwood's command did not operate in a vacuum. British and Dutch submarines, displaced from their bases in Asia by the Japanese advance, also prowled the same waters, often operating out of the same Australian ports as their American counterparts. How did these different navies, with their distinct doctrines, technologies, and traditions, coordinate their efforts? The historical record here is quieter, less clear. It speaks to a shadow war within a shadow war, a complex dance of shared intelligence and deconflicted patrol zones. One has to wonder about the conversations that took place in those remote naval bases, about the blending of tactics, and the quiet rivalries between allied skippers hunting the same prey in the vast emptiness of the ocean. The very name by which they became known speaks to the nature of their war, the Silent Service. It was a name born of necessity. Unlike the great carrier battles or island invasions, the submarine campaign was largely invisible, its victories marked only by cryptic radio signals and lists of enemy tonnage sunk. This secrecy created an aura of mystique, a public image of an elite, enigmatic force. The submariner was not the dashing fighter pilot or the rugged marine storming a beach. He was a quiet professional, a technician of naval warfare, waging a lonely, cerebral battle in a steel tube far from the eyes of the world. This image, part reality and part myth, has defined the submarine service ever since. Behind the avuncular Uncle Charlie persona was a man who bore an almost unbearable weight. Lockwood was responsible for the lives of thousands of young men, sent out on patrols from which 1 in 5 would never return. This was one of the highest loss rates of any branch of the American armed forces. Every decision he made, every patrol zone he assigned, carried the potential for catastrophic failure. How does a commander live with that? He fought relentlessly for better equipment, most notably for torpedoes that actually worked. But in the end, he had to keep sending his boats out, knowing the terrible odds. The warm smile on the pier must have often masked a private grief for the crews who would never see home again. When the war ended and the stories could finally be told, Hollywood was quick to seize on the inherent drama of the submarine war. Films like Destination Tokyo and Run Silent, Run Deep brought the tension of the underwater hunt to the big screen. They crafted a powerful, enduring image of the American submariner, a stoic hero battling depth charges and a cunning enemy. But these cinematic portrayals, for all their drama, could only ever be a sketch of the reality. They rarely captured the long, grinding weeks of boredom, the suffocating heat of a submerged diesel boat in the tropics, or the sheer, nerve-shredding exhaustion of a multi-day pursuit. The myth, as is so often the case, was cleaner and more heroic than the messy, terrifying, and often monotonous truth. And what of Charles Lockwood himself? Why does his name not resonate in the popular consciousness alongside the likes of Nimitz, Halsey, or MacArthur? Perhaps it is because his victory was not won in a single thunderous battle. There was no dramatic surrender on the deck of his flagship. His triumph was incremental, a slow, methodical strangulation of an entire empire, measured in shipping ledgers and industrial output charts. It was a victory of logistics and strategy, less cinematic than a carrier duel, but arguably more decisive. The quiet admiral who oversaw this campaign remains, in many ways, as elusive as the service he commanded, a pivotal figure whose true importance in the Allied victory is still, perhaps, not fully understood.